Joining us now is Heidi Sloan, congressional candidate for Texas's 25th district. Heidi, I apologize for that lead-in. Thank you for joining us.
No problem at all. Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. So very exciting. You're running for the US House in Texas's 25th district. What encouraged you to run?
Well, I've been a part of a lot of local campaigns for a number of years now. And for me, it is that organizing. It is standing with people who are directly affected by the policies and by the movement that has potential to change our lives. It is seeing everyday folks show up and fight and stand with their neighbors, not necessarily for something that is directly affecting them right now, but for something they can envision standing in solidarity for in the long term. And it is knowing how impactful it is to talk to our neighbors, knowing how impactful it is to bring people closer to the empowerment of their own voices. That led me to this vision. We've worked on a lot of campaigns at the city and the state level. We've influenced some federal congressional representatives, but to think that we could use a platform running for Congress to continue to grow organizers and to bring more people into this work alongside of us is the heart and soul of what we're doing here in Texas.
So when I go through the list of progressive proposals that we're seeing, in this presidential election, you appear to be on the right side for a lot of these issues. So you're a supporter of Medicare for all, Green New Deal, workers' rights, safety and liberation for marginalized people. I love that, and I want to elaborate on that a little more later in the interview. But before we get to domestic policy, I wanted to ask you about something that's very much in the news right now. How would you, as a member of Congress, handle US foreign policy differently, particularly the escalating tensions with Iran?
I think it's really interesting to come at this from a background of centering the working class domestically, and to realize that to support and to lead alongside the working class here in the US is to support the working class internationally. And so many of the methods of international relations that we have developed are top down, are influencing those in leadership and those in power, rather than saying, how do we actually stand with people on the ground? How do we stand with working people across the world and create conditions that empower them towards more democratic governance, towards their own agency, and towards a future that works for all of us? And so whether we are talking about relationships with Mexico or we are talking about relationships with Iran, I really want to focus on how our actions affect people who are struggling to live their day-to-day lives, who are affected by their own governance, by the people in power in their own countries, and how we can meet those folks on common ground and to support them first and foremost, rather than letting the working class be an afterthought in our international politics.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I love that you're tackling this from a more comprehensive perspective, because oftentimes I think that our politicians think of domestic politics and international relations as two separate things, but they're very much intertwined. And a lot of Americans feel frustration over the fact that so much of our money, so many of our resources go toward fighting these wars that we don't, first of all, many of our actions have led to, but more importantly, our actions further destabilize regions like the Middle East, for instance. And so in my opinion, this is just my analysis into the situation with Iran, I think that the endless wars are intentionally endless because there is a huge industry that profits off of it. So I love the way that you're tackling that. So let's talk a little bit about the fact that you're running in Texas. Texas is, of course, quickly changing. It's no longer a solid red state. You have more progressives moving into the state, especially from places like California, for instance, for affordability reasons. So that's good news. But how are you responding to maybe some of those independent voters that aren't as progressive or don't identify as progressive, but are interested in your messaging? How are you reaching out to them and making your case?
Right, and I wouldn't necessarily say we're using a strategies particularly for the independent voters. What I usually say is that we are reaching out to folks who are politically disenfranchised, folks for whom the ideology has not directly spoken to their lives and their own conditions, meeting them in that space, and not really starting with this idea that there is a left and there is a right, and you're either on the correct side of that or you're on the wrong side of that, but actually there is a top and there is a bottom, and things look drastically different for the vast majority of us who are on that bottom layer, who are struggling, working 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to get by. And your politics should not be so dislocated from your everyday working life, your home life, your education, your healthcare. Actually, those are interconnected, and it is a false narrative that is perpetuated to keep people who are so busy just trying to manage their very existence from speaking out. This narrative that disconnects those two spaces for us. And so what we're doing is actually going and talking to a whole lot of people, Democrats, independents, and even Republicans, and increasingly Republicans as we move into the general, about what it means to have a politics that puts your life and the lives of your neighbors in the center of that paradigm. And like I said before, I believe that is where we find solidarity, that actually that human root of self-centeredness does not conflict with wanting to be absolutely for your neighbor as well, and seeing how we can work towards policies that do both of those things.
You know, Bernie Sanders has this strategy of really honing in on the issue that unites all of us, and it's the issue of economic injustice. And so I see a lot of people who ended up voting for Donald Trump argue that if Bernie were the Democratic nominee, they would be open to voting for him because he talks about the issues that they care about the most. You know, a lot of Trump supporters, while yes, there's some portion of them who supported him because of the unsavory, terrible things that he said about disenfranchised groups, there's still a pretty significant portion that feel neglected, left behind, and frustrated about the economic situation. So I'm curious, as you're reaching out to Republican voters, what has their reaction been? Because Republican voters in particular have been primed to be afraid of candidates like you. You know, you go to DSA meetings, oh, Democratic Socialists, we should be afraid. They're gonna try to take away our rights. Obviously, those are all lies, but I'm curious how they react when you reach out to them and you just kind of explain what your positions are.
Right. So a great example of this is talking about a Green New Deal. This is a policy that is very popular across the country, but definitely not as much so in these kinds of spaces. There is a lot of fear mongering that happens with that particular branding. And so when we go and talk about a Green New Deal, we're not talking about sort of liberal or progressive leaders top-down analytical approach to solving climate crisis. We're talking about a federal jobs guarantee. We're talking about making sure farmers get paid fair wages to take care of their land. We're talking about infrastructure in rural areas. We're talking about these policies in a way that bridges that gap, that really takes away the power of that divisive rhetoric, and we have receipts for it. Honestly, when we talk about immigration and the race to the bottom, we say, well, what would happen if corporations were required to pay immigrants a fair and living wage, and immigrants were allowed to organize alongside of us in our workplaces? Well, we would all win. And people see that. They see how they have been undercut, whether it is by the immigration system or the criminal justice system. They understand that our economy is controlled by a few, and they are always looking for ways of breaking up the working class and keeping us weak and against one another. So when we bring our receipts to that table, when we meet people in their need and in their fear and in their worry and say to them, there is a reason that you are worried, and it is because the top has instilled this notion that we can do no other than be infighting all of the time. But there is another world that we can build if we stand with one another. Then we actually begin to make progress and move people.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Now, this message is incredibly threatening to corporate Democrats. And I've personally seen how vicious they can be to progressives who want bold change. And I'm curious, through your organizing, through your campaigning, have you experienced any of that pushback from, the establishment Democrats or anything?
It's interesting because no one self-identifies as a corporate Democrat around here. And so what we get a lot of instead is, why would you try to divide the Democratic Party? Why would you stand against any policies that a Democrat has put forward? And for me, I'm coming at this from a background of having moved other congressional representatives, relatively good congressional representatives, to sign on to bills like Medicare for All. And in organizing, we power map and we move key figures. We organize our allies first, or our potential allies first, and then we organize the harder ones to come alongside with their power and their movements added to our own. And so for me, it doesn't feel like this war. It feels like here we are standing up, making our demands known. And that if we are truly the Democratic Party of progressives that we say we are, that can't be wrong. It is only making us sharper. What I think is interesting is as AOC has been talking about lately, is that actually the root of the Democratic Party? Do we actually want to be bringing voices from the grassroots on up, developing better and better politics and involving more and more people, or does that generate fear? And if that generates fear, then that's a moment for the Democratic Party to do some real reflection. Absolutely. I know where I stand.
Yep, well said, well said. Heidi Sloan, congressional candidate for Texas's 25th district. Please learn more about her campaign and donate by going to HeidiSloan.com or HeidiSloan.com/donate specifically if you're looking to contribute to her campaign. You can also volunteer by going to HeidiSloan.com/volunteer. Thank you so much, Heidi, and all the best luck to you.
Thanks, Anna. Thanks so much.